You are bad at trading in your fantasy football league. Now, I know the problem. I know how to fix it. And I want to go through the psychology of a fantasy football trader and how we can go through and how we can actually start winning our fantasy football trades this season. Now, the first thing I want to discuss is how people view values in fantasy, right? Everybody understands you can look at a rankings list. You can see wide receiver 1's going to be worth a lot more than wide receiver 20. And they think, yeah, as you go down the rankings, obviously these players are worth less and less and less. That makes sense. But once you play fantasy football for a while, you realize it's not a gradual fall that you have down these rankings. It's not like the wide receiver 20 is worth close to the wide receiver 1. And you realize actually the drop off is going to be much steeper as we fall down rankings. And typically I want to go through and instead I want to be trying to get the players that are going to be better overall. I'm going to be fine giving up a little bit more depth and getting a stud. But in reality, even viewing these trades in this kind of light, it doesn't really demonstrate the true fall off that you have from the true studs in fantasy football. And this is why if you go through and look at any fantasy football trade calculator, they are going to be broken. I've never seen a fantasy football trade calculator that I like. And that is why we are hiring multiple full-time developers for flogfantasy.com. And I promise you, we will get you the best fantasy football trade calculator on this planet. But the reality of the situation and how you should be viewing values in fantasy football is you should be looking at a dramatic fall off. You should be looking more so at a square root type curve where you are going to be getting a significant fall off at the beginning where it more so rounds out as you get deeper down. So the actual example of this is the difference between the wide receiver 1 to the wide receiver 5 is going to be most likely a lot bigger than the difference between the wide receiver 10 and the wide receiver 50. And I know that sounds crazy. Obviously, if you were to go through and do simple math, it doesn't really make sense. But let me lay this out in a couple different ways. So a lot of people also view it in terms of maybe monetary. You just want to assign a number to a player's value, where you're looking at players in fantasy and you're going, okay, well, this guy, he's worth, say, a quarter. This guy's worth a dime. This guy's worth a quarter, and this one's worth a quarter. I want to go through and I want to trade for a player that's worth, say, $1. So let me take these 4 guys that are worth a quarter. Let's send them for this one guy that's worth $1. Fair, even exchange, bango, bongo. No, that can't really happen because what you actually have is that player at the very top is worth so much that just taking depth pieces and putting them together, if you are getting a stud in return, 99% of the time, you are getting the better deal, and the person going through and trading for a bunch of duds, a bunch of depth pieces is making a massive mistake because there's an inherent cost when you go through and when you trade for multiple pieces in fantasy football. That cost is going to be a roster spot. You have to remember that your roster spots are actually valuable. When you go through and when you make a 1 for 2, when you make a 1 for 3 trade, you are going to be giving up roster spots. You have to go through, you have to cut players at the bottom end of your roster, which maybe you're going to be fine with for the moment. Maybe at the bottom end of your roster, you have someone like Juju Smith-Schuster that you're fine letting go. But then all of a sudden, when you backfill with that, maybe like another depth wide receiver, say Jahan Dotson, that I know some people like. I think he's a talented player, but he's the perfect example of this. You put Dotson in your last roster spot, then all of a sudden you put yourself in a little bit of a golden cage where you can't go out there and you can't make waiver wire moves. You're going to be operating with your hands tied behind your back through the rest of the season. Whereas that team that went out there and they traded you Jahan Dotson, Jerry Jeudy, DJ Moore, and Christian Kirk just to get the one stud in return in Stephon Diggs, they're getting the 3 open roster spots. They're going to be able to make waiver wire moves. They're going to be the team that's able to backfill and find the next Kyron Williams and find the next Jerome Ford and find the next Zach Moss, find the next Kareem Hunt. And in reality, what's going to happen 2 to 3 weeks from now, where you thought you had an even deal, once that other team actually works the waiver wire and you look at the net result of that trade, almost at all times, the player that is getting the best guy is going to win the deal. Now, of course, this is a very basic way to look at it. So I want to get a little more nuanced. I want to look at your exact league settings and how that's going to change this overall graph of value. And then I also want to be going into and looking at some real fantasy football trades that were made this week. And I want to grade them. I want to show why they worked, why they maybe didn't. But before we get into it, of course, if you have not done so already, drop a like in the video, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. And if you want to check out any of these pick'ems for this weekend, you can find those on Underdog Fantasy. Underdog has a brand new offer right now. I wish I would have known about this a while ago. They are matching anybody's first deposit dollar for dollar up to $500 at the moment. Plus, you're going to be getting a Lamar Jackson special pick'em, more than less than half a total yard this weekend against the Indianapolis Colts. Plus, with promo code FLOCK, you're going to be getting an updated list of our top 150 rest of season rankings and tiers. And we've shipped out about 100 hats so far, have another few under to send with shirts. So please make sure you fill out that Google form in the Discord. If you use promo code FLOCK on Underdog, get yourself a free hat. But let's go through and let's look at how we should be changing the way that we view things based off our actual league settings. So first, I want to look at a league that I know some people are playing in, and this is going to be maybe a little bit more of a rare occurrence. If you're going to be playing in, say, a 14-team league where you have a large bench, where you have, say, 2 flex spots, then at that point, the actual value of a roster spot is going to be worth significantly less because the amount of players that we can go off of the waiver wire for will be greatly diminished. So if you're looking at a graph in, say, a deep league with limited waiver wire options, it's going to be significantly more flat. Now, of course, you're still going to have the larger fall off as we get closer to those stud players. But as you go down the line, it's going to be flattened out and more guys are going to have more value overall. Whereas if you play, say, in a shallow league where there are a ton of waiver wire options, it is going to be a very, very steep fall off. And you should almost be viewing the x-axis as the last player that has actual trade value and the last player that is worth more than a roster spot. Because keep in mind, if you have better options on the waiver wire, value over replacement is going to be a lot harder to come by. And naturally, there'll be fewer players that provide that. So if you're playing in that deeper format where you have very limited options on waivers, then at that point, you're going to be more inclined to go for the depth trade. You're going to be more inclined to go ahead and trade away Tyreek Hill and maybe get back in return Amon-Ra St. Brown and, I don't know, let's throw in Travis Etienne, right? Whereas if you're playing in, say, a 10-team league where you only have 1 flex and you only have 5 bench spots, there, because your waiver wire is going to be so strong, you're doing almost anything that you can to go out there and trade for the Tyreek Hill level player. You're fine giving up, say, Mike Evans and Josh Jacobs. I mean, the perfect example is this trade that we have coming out from Danny. Y'all know Danny from Fantasy Stock Exchange over there on flockfantasy.com. He ended up trading away Mike Evans, Josh Jacobs, Matt Breida, Terry McLaurin for Roschon Johnson, Chris Godwin, and Tyreek Hill. Now, if we visualize this on those charts that we were discussing, Tyreek Hill is at the very, very top before you have any of that value fall off, where you have Mike Evans, Godwin, Josh Jacobs somewhere in the middle of the slope. And then at the very end of the slope, barely worth more than a roster spot, but still has some name appeal. You have guys like Roschon Johnson, Matt Breida, Terry McLaurin. But ultimately, if you look at that value fall off that you have from the elite level player like Tyreek Hill, fundamentally, if you're looking at players like Roschon, Matt Breida, Terry McLaurin, they just kind of clog up this deal and you would almost remove them. Obviously, you can use them as tiebreakers, but the fundamental trade is, would we rather have Tyreek Hill and Chris Godwin or Mike Evans and Josh Jacobs? You look at the volume from Godwin and Evans that they've had in this offense. They look very similar, so we can almost take them out, say you'd rather have Evans slightly, but still, would you rather have Tyreek or Jacobs? It's going to be Tyreek and it's not going to be close. So we're going to take the best player in the deal based off that value graph, based off what we are looking for. So we're going to go Tyreek Hill here. We go over to another group of guys over there on flockfantasy.com, Domain Fantasy. We have them trading away Brandon Ayuk and Jake Ferguson for TJ Hawkinson. We go back to that graph. Jake Ferguson is almost near the bottom, right? Jake Ferguson is a player that maybe you can be excited about his upside, but fundamentally, at the end of the day, you wouldn't be too surprised if you're wanting that open roster spot to make a waiver wire move, say 2 weeks from now. So fundamentally, if we're sending Brandon Ayuk for TJ Hawkinson, that's the meat of this deal. That's the meat and potatoes. Jake Ferguson's the little garnish on it. We want to have TJ Hawkinson over Brandon Ayuk, so we love that trade. Let's go and look at this trade from Jack, where he sends Burrow and Chase for Josh Allen and Drake London. Now, this is going to be one of those trades that I don't like, because if I'm having to map out who is the more valuable player here, I think that Jamar Chase is still going to be an elite level stud. I would prefer Chase straight up over Burrow or over Allen or over Drake London. Now, at the same time, Drake London is a player that's a little bit exciting, but he just doesn't come close to moving the needle when we're talking about these guys like Josh Allen and Jamar Chase at the very, very top end, right? And then I would even say that Joe Burrow, in my mind, has more value over Drake London, even if he is dealing with this injury currently. So if I fundamentally ask myself, okay, would I rather have Chase or whatever, I rather have Allen, I'm going to go with the Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase side, and I'm going to be making the consolidated bet that the Cincinnati Bengals maybe go through and just put it together, that Burrow finally gets healthy. Now, going over to our next deal, we're going to be looking at a team trading for James Cook and Zach Moss. On the other side, you're going to be looking at Kyle Pitts, Dameon Pierce, and Calvin Ridley. Now, would I rather have James Cook or Calvin Ridley? I'd rather have Calvin Ridley. I think Ridley is the best player in this deal. Would I rather have Zach Moss versus Kyle Pitts, Dameon Pierce? Well, in the short to immediate term, maybe Zach Moss, where Kyle Pitts doesn't really look like a startable tight end, where Dameon Pierce has every single offensive lineman injured in Houston, and he's in a three-man running back by committee. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, Zach Moss is a player that we can be excited about starting over the next 2 weeks. But a month from now, is he going to be a player that is significantly ahead of other options on the waiver wire? That's questionable. We don't know that. We know Calvin Ridley will be. So we're going to go with the Calvin Ridley, Kyle Pitts, and Dameon Pierce side. Going over to our next trade, this one is just an easy no-brainer. Someone trades Nico Collins and Jalen Warren. They get A.J. Brown. Now, I know that this isn't maybe the exact trade, but I do want to bring this up. We've been talking about this in live streams as of late. This is just a general rule of thumb. And I understand Nico, Jalen Warren may not have came from your waiver wire, but you took them at the very end of your fantasy football draft. I'm more so thinking about Kyron Williams, more so thinking about Puka. These players that you did get off of your waiver wire, I'm seeing a lot of trades where people go and send Puka in a small piece and they get Jamar Chase. They send Puka and they get A.J. Brown straight up. If you go through fantasy football history over the past 10 years and every single opportunity that you had, that you picked up a player from the waiver wire and then 2 weeks later traded them for a healthy player that went in round one in your fantasy football draft, about 90% of the time, that is a good move. 90% of the time, taking the guy you got off waivers and sending it for the bona fide stud is something you want to be doing, ladies and gentlemen. Our next deal will be Amon-Ra St. Brown versus Evans and Calvin Ridley. Now, this is a very interesting trade where I would say Amon-Ra St. Brown's probably the more valuable guy. But if we graph these players out, what is the fundamental difference between Amon-Ra St. Brown and Calvin Ridley? Especially with Amon-Ra St. Brown possibly dealing with some injuries. They are relatively close. So if you get Evans, who then this person traded for Josh Jacobs, I do think this is the one example where these players are close enough. The best player on one side, Calvin Ridley, the best player on the other for Amon-Ra St. Brown, where those secondary pieces such as Mike Evans and or Josh Jacobs are large enough to swing the deal to the package. So this is going to be one of the very few trades where we actually would take the package here. Going to our next deal, this is an example of going through and trading 3 dimes and getting back a quarter in return. You're trading Kenneth Gainwell, Romeo Doubs, Dameon Pierce, all these guys that have a little bit of value. You can make an argument that they're all a little exciting for one reason or another, but we are getting a player that is very exciting. And this person saying we needed a bench spot in case Burrow is out. We wanted to go land on Gibbs. Going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this video, you want to make the deal. You want to get the open bench spots. That way we have more flexibility off the waiver wire and how we can construct our team. That is beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. If you can ever take the last 2 players on your roster and go send a 3-for-1 deal where we get the best player in the deal, we want to do that, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this other team lost J.K. Dobbins, Saquon, and Breece is obviously Breece Hall at this moment. So they go out there, they trade for a running back. They send Zay Flowers for Javonte Williams. Honestly, fair deal, up to you. I probably prefer Javonte, but they are similar in value. And then also looking at Romeo Doubs, Elijah Moore. These pieces fundamentally don't matter in this trade. It's your personal preference. If we needed a running back, getting Javonte Williams here makes a lot of sense. Now, going over to our next deal, this one's a very good example of a team that is taking advantage of the situation that they are in. They are currently 2-0, so we are looking long-term. Once you begin to see teams that are 2-0, once you begin to see teams that are 3-0, 4-0, 4-1, at that point, we are thinking fantasy football playoffs. What can we do to set this team up with the long-term upside? So they take advantage. They go trade Raheem Mostert and DJ Moore to get Cooper Kupp in return, presumably from a team that maybe lost Nick Chubb, from a team that maybe lost J.K. Dobbins, that needed a running back in the short term. And we get the best player for the long term on a 2-0 roster where we are thinking fantasy football playoffs. Next trade, we're looking at Amon-Ra St. Brown versus Saquon Barkley and Jordan Love. I mean, here, I just want to say Jordan Love has no impact on this deal whatsoever. I'm not going to weigh in on would you rather have St. Brown, would you rather have Barkley. I think that very much is up to you in your overall roster, but I do just use this as an example. Going back to that chart, going back to that graph, Jordan Love is down there near the X-axis where his value over replacement in a 10-team PPR redraft league isn't really there. There are going to be a bunch of quarterbacks in the waiver wire that are maybe slightly worse than Jordan Love right now, but we don't know what's going to happen. That open roster spot has value. So I think it's just down to, do you want Barkley or do you want St. Brown? You would never think about Jordan Love in a deal like this. Now, going over to our next trade, we're going to be looking at Dallas Goedert, Derrick Henry versus Amari, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Hunter Henry. First thing we do, kind of take out the useless players, the guys we just got off the waiver wire, say Hunter Henry. I know he has upside, but fundamentally, I mean, another example of this that we like to give is if you're trading, say, Derrick Henry for Amari and Jahmyr Gibbs, you're going through and saying, hey man, I'll trade my Ferrari for your Lamborghini. And then someone goes, hey, let me throw in the little tree that hangs from the dash that makes the car smell good. That's Hunter Henry. Fundamentally, it doesn't matter. It matters, do you want a Ferrari? Do you want a Lamborghini? The little tree on the dash doesn't make any impact whatsoever. So I know Henry is exciting in his own right, and I know that maybe the tree on the dash has some value, but when you're removing such large pieces like Derrick Henry, the tree on the dash means absolutely nothing. So yeah, it's Derrick Henry versus Amari Cooper and Jahmyr Gibbs. I think this is a good example if you're in that, say, 10-team league where you only have one flex and waiver wire options are going to be plentiful and we want to go through, we want to get the best player, you go Derrick Henry. Maybe if this is that team where it's a 14-team full BBR format where you start 3 wide receivers and 2 flexes, having as many startable players as possible matters, then maybe you want to go ahead and get the package. Our next deal, we're looking at Stephon Diggs, Rachaad White versus Mike Evans or Ramondre Stevenson. Diggs, best player in the deal. I think Diggs over Evans, massive downgrade. White versus Ramondre, slight upgrade, but nonetheless, we are going to be going best player in the deal here. We are using that as the tiebreaker based off that value chart. And I hope this video helped you out. I really want to make sure that we are all doing the best that we can. So y'all are still with me in weeks 12, 13, 14. We have a bunch of teams going to the fantasy football playoffs. But thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. I really do appreciate you. Please let me know in the comment section if you've been able to make any trades as of late. I would love to talk through those. Would love to look at those for you. And yeah, of course, if you want to check out any of those pick'ems on Underdog Fantasy, make sure you take advantage of their offer. Promo code FLOCK, 100% deposit match up to $500. And also, you're going to get a special Lamar Jackson pick'em this week, more than less than half a total yard against Indianapolis. You're going to get our rest of season 2023 fantasy football rankings and tiers. And you are going to be getting a Flock Fantasy ad if you go out there and use promo code FLOCK, be in the flockfantasy.com Discord, fill out that Google form. We just shipped out like 100. Going to be excited to get y'all a lot more. But thank you again. Really do appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day and really hope we get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.